Welcome. My name is Jody Craner. I'm with Wisconsin Alzheimer's Institute. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today for the webinar on Caregiver Roadmap. Our presenter is Carley Prochaska. Carley is open to taking questions during her presentation, as long as we can get through the materials that work out well. So feel free to put your questions and comments in chat. And then you can also use your emoji hand, and I'll watch the chat as well as for the emojis. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Carley. She is a dementia care specialist for the Aging and Disability Resource Center of Portage County. Carley has been in her DCS role since 2016. Prior to that, she worked as an assistant resident director at a memory care facility after she had completed college. She also has a history of being a CNA for a number of years. Within the past 7 years in her dementia care specialist role, Carley has found a strong passion for providing education and creating awareness for dementia within her community. Now it's my pleasure to turn the webinar over to Carley.
Thank you, Jody. So what I'm going to do for kind of organizing the webinar today is I'm going to start to kind of talk about what the tool is and how we created it, and then how we use it on an individual basis. And then the majority of it is going to be how we've turned it into like an educational panel presentation. But feel free to ask questions as we go through, because I think it's more effective. We actually did this presentation in May at the Alzheimer's conference as well. So it can be used on an individual basis or in a group setting. So to kind of start, so what is the roadmap? You guys also will have access to having the roadmap. Jody's going to upload that on the WDRN website, so you'll have access to that. But in 2019, we kind of got together as our caregiver coalition, and the question that we always get at our offices is, I'm a caregiver, what's next, right? What are the next steps? What do I need to plan for? I wish there was a tool that showed us what the future could look like. And I think as we can't predict what services somebody's going to need, it helps in planning what could be down the line for them. And sometimes they can be the road, straight to, maybe they don't need home care, they go straight to a facility, but it does get them to start thinking about resources in their community and maybe things that they didn't even think of. A lot of the times in our conversations, people are saying, well, I didn't know I had to do a power of attorney. I haven't had one. So now we're, 50, 60, 70, 80 years old thinking about power of attorneys when we never thought of it. So we kind of came together and we're like, how can we make this work? How can we create something that's very simple and it doesn't overwhelm somebody? So that's kind of how the caregiver roadmap started. We didn't know, once we had the roadmap, what were we going to actually use it for? We thought maybe it would just be individual, just to help caregivers have the visual, but it's kind of created into something more. So this is the visual of the roadmap. You'll see there is services on here that aren't addressed. So if you look at like the end of life side, palliative care isn't a bullet point on there. We wanted it to be as generic as possible, so then we could still use it as a conversation tool. So it is kind of like the high points that somebody may use, if they're saying CBRF, or maybe they're saying, okay, well, they need to go to a nursing home. Being able to also explain the differences was very helpful. So we have this obviously as the front, and then on the back, there actually is definitions that fit with, if somebody is saying, you need to go to a CBRF. Some people are like, okay, what's that? Or we know a lot of times people think that all facilities are nursing homes. So it really started to become an educational piece of, okay, so where are you on the roadmap? Can you identify where you are? And what questions do you have? So when this was created, we started having it as a conversation tool in our offices. Our caregiver services manager, who does AFCSP and NFCSP, she's able to then kind of keep that in their file of things they've talked about. When I've used it in the DCS role, I've told families, all right, if we're going to help plan kind of what the future looks like, some families will use this tool and they'll write down, like if they've gone to, let's say, facilities, they write down their top 3 or type 5, and then they can actually have it as a reference for every single service that they may potentially need down the road. They've already had the decision. So when they look at their roadmap, they know if they need to go to home care, they already have talked to the agencies. They already have one that they're, would prefer to go with. And it's kind of their, safe zone of, I've gone through every single plan. Will it go as planned? We all know, not, sometimes not. But a lot of people have been like, it's finally nice to have something that could lay out what my future could potentially look like. And as we have conversations about, if you're going to the home care side, do you know if you need home health or do you need supportive home care? So then when we started seeing kind of the individual basis of how we were consulting back and forth, it then turned into, this could be so much more. How can we use this as an educational tool? So then it changed to, these photos are what the panel looks like. So what we've changed the roadmap into is this educational panel of about 10 to 12 professionals. We wanted to keep it small, as small as possible, of course, when you have all these pit stops, because we wanted to be aware that it was going to take time. So you can see in these pictures, we have a representative from every single pit stop on the caregiver roadmap. And it takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours to get through this. And what we do, usually we start obviously at the clinic because that's kind of the beginning part of the roadmap. But we do break it down of, okay, give us kind of a 5 to 10 minute spiel of what's the most important part of this. And throughout this webinar, I'll break it down kind of how we do section by section. But this is, the professionals come from our Caregiver Coalition. So basically we say we have a roadmap panel coming up. If you want to participate, once that spot's filled, great. So there's no bias as far as who attends. Obviously one person per each pit stop. Otherwise we'd have, multiple people representing the same thing. People basically will introduce themselves from whatever company they are, but the information they share is very generic. So it basically talks about, payer sources. How do you find these resources? And then there's questions that we prompt. So usually we like to say I'm the MC of it. So I run it as kind of the facilitator of, okay, we're going to start at the clinic, and after every single stop, we ask the audience, do you have any questions for this professional? And I think that's been very helpful because people are able to ask questions that maybe they would have needed to schedule an appointment for. Maybe they would have, never thought of that, because as conversations happening in the audience, now they're having these light bulb moments of, oh, well, I didn't think of that. Or finding out referral sources, thinking that maybe their provider has to give them a referral for something. And I think the coolest thing about the panel is they're all learning from each other. And I think the caregivers finally get to see how all of these disciplinary people work together. It's not one person. So once you're handed off with, let's say, the ADRC, you don't really stop your connection with the ADRC. Maybe they're helping get you services. You're meeting with an options council and they're getting you options for assisted living. So they're all connected. And I think it shows the caregivers that it really does take a team to help support through services. So we actually kind of modified it now. So in the second picture on the right, you'll see that the tables are a little bit at a curve. We found that it was so much more helpful for the panel members to be able to talk to each other across the table instead of kind of peeking around each other in that straight line. And we've had, groups where there's been 2 people. We've had groups where there's been 20 plus. And I think the coolest thing about that is we always go over time. It's not of, well, if there's only 2 people, I guess we're getting out of here early. There's so much information, and the people are so thankful that once they leave, they're able to say, okay, I know a contact. So if they are brand new to the community, we've had that where they don't even know what agencies are available. They've never been connected to the ADRC. They just don't know where to go. They now have a local contact to at least reach out to and say, all right, I saw you at the panel. Now what? And people can then help through any kind of questions. The panel members always stay after. So if somebody isn't comfortable asking a question in front of the group, there is panel members that they can talk to afterwards. And from this last year, we created our Caregiver Roadmap Resource event, which that basically is a caregiver conference. And the breakout sessions basically come from different pit stops. Last year, we had it obviously for the first time, and we had 65 people registered, and over half of them had never heard of the ADRC before. So it has been kind of cool to see that this was just an individual project that we were going to use one-on-one, and it now has become kind of a educational tool. So for those of you on the call, you're absolutely you're able to use this in your day-to-day. The only thing that the coalition asks is that you just give credit where credit's due. They say it just came from Portage County, but other than that, it's fair game for you guys to add anything to it. Because I think depending on your community, there is going to be certain things that you add into the pit stop. I know that Brown County is adopting it. and doing it for their Hmong community and doing it for like the health promotion side of things. So it really is just a tool that why recreate the wheel if it's already there. So like I said, that will be a resource of you guys. So now to kind of break it down into how we facilitate the panel. So obviously with the clinic side, when you think of who can represent this, typically we've had providers, we've also had discharge planners. So it really, you want somebody in the medical community to sit on this spot because they can show why is it important to have a provider. So when you're looking at your journey, why is it important? What can they benefit you from? And I think the reason we always tell people is they know your baseline, they know your history, they know what services you could potentially benefit from. And if a referral is needed, this is where your referral could come from. It also can be a doctor that follows you if you need orders for home health. There is a lot of connections that a lot of the caregivers just didn't know. So if there's any kind of medical champion in your community, that would be a perfect person to ask, would you sit on this panel? We do it quarterly. So if people want, they only can commit to one, at least it's something. I think the community involvement, it says a lot to have a provider on the panel because I think they show a different perspective and again, learn from each other. There's been providers that we've had on the panel that have heard about maybe non-traditional funeral services that they knew nothing about, and everybody learns from each other every single time we do it. So it's very cool to kind of see how the systems all work separately, but this roadmap has kind of brought everybody together to see like, how can we benefit each other? How can we make the referrals more seamless? And then also when the caregivers come, they're able to get all of the information at one time. And we tell them when we started that it is overwhelming. We've got caregivers that have come to 3 panels because there's so much information that they feel like if they miss anything, they come to a next one and see if there's anything different. And depending on who's on that panel, you might have different information that's shared that maybe was missed or ran out of time, but then you're able to connect all the dots. So that's the clinic side at the beginning of the panel. So then we move into the ADRC side, and I think this can be very complex for people too. And how we do this is obviously somebody from the ADRC sits on the panel, and we have our caregiver support services manager who facilitates this section. And what she does is basically does a very broad overview of what the ADRC has. Because I think if we think of the ADRC in general, if you're a caregiver, you don't necessarily always just need to go to caregiver support services. Maybe it's nutrition, that's something that can help. Maybe it's home delivered meals. Maybe it's respite and adult day center. Like, I think it comes where a lot of the caregivers like, oh, so everything that I need could be under this roof if I didn't know, right? If I'm only here for the support group or I'm only here for powerful tools, we're able to share kind of that overview. Obviously, if you're talking about an ADRC or any of these pit stops in general, it truly could take a whole presentation itself. So we start kind of that broad overview of if they walk into our building specifically, what services would be available for them to explore and who could be their first point of contact. So for us, obviously the information and assistance specialists are beneficial because, right, they have all of that information and can help with referral source. So when we go through kind of scenario based of people who are attending the panel, people may say, well, if I need help with, chore services, so I need a housekeeper, how does that work? Then we're able to give them kind of the, quick runaround of, okay, base of time, let's see if we meet afterwards and we can print them chore provider lists, or we can get them connected with an information and assistance specialist the day they're here. And I think that's been very helpful too, because they're not having to make another appointment. We're trying to make it as easy for the caregivers. If they're spending their time at the panel, then we want them to be connected with that local resource. So it's a little bit easier of a transition. And maybe if their person that they're taking care of needs respite, then it's one less day that they have to organize respite. They can all just get it done in that specific day. When we have kind of the audience, we let them guide the questions. So if there's kind of the time where your panel member has kind of done their spiel and no one has questions, usually we'll kind of prompt additional questions. So for the ADRC, we usually just say, if you're from a different county attending, because people can attend virtually as well, we always tell them that different programs, depending on the county, can be called different names. So the best thing is to describe the program, not necessarily name it. So that's usually how we kind of break it down. If there's no questions or people just don't know what to ask, I will be the one to usually facilitate the questions that we've heard with previous panels, or maybe just ones that we hear day to day in the ADRC or whatever kind of topic with home health or whatever that may be, we say, well, what about this question? What about this scenario? And usually the caregivers can then jump in and say, okay, what about this? What about this? And sometimes it does go ahead, right? If they have a question that necessarily isn't related to the pit stop you're on, that's okay. It's harmless, right? It's not going to hurt if somebody just kind of jumps in ahead of the time. It's better to have them have the information than for them to say, well, wait till we get to the pit stop, because at that point, it might just not connect. So it's just easier to answer questions as they come. Next, obviously, home care. So for this one, when we do the panel, we have somebody from the supportive home care side, as well as the home health side. And the reason we decided that is because there's so many kind of confusing aspects of home health and supportive home care being the same thing, being the non-medical versus medical supports. So just on the screen, it's basically how we break it down in the panel. I'm just kind of showing the differences, but also how they work together. A lot of times we'll have, we actually have the general manager of one home care agency. We have some of the social workers from home health, some of their account liaisons. So basically you just want somebody who's going to be able to have the knowledge to share what does home health do that supportive home care couldn't. And then the respite side usually gets shared throughout the panel. So it can be shared specifically for our ADRC, since we have an adult day center here. The facilities that are represented on the panel will talk about the respite stays. Even if the hospice agencies have respite, so respite kind of goes throughout, and we explain that to everybody, that even though respite is under home care, right? Respite can be throughout the journey. It's not just in the beginning stages. It doesn't mean that, you know, if somebody's on hospice at home that you still don't get respite. So we just explain that respite is a kind of journey long thing. It's not just a segment of a pit stop. And then what we do for this, when people are talking, a lot of times when they're kind of sharing the experience, people want to know the payer source. So sometimes above, when we get kind of together with the group before we do the panel, we usually have the high points of talk about payer sources, talk about referrals. But sometimes if somebody's asking a different question, it can be missed. So we always make sure that a payer source is always discussed, so people know, is it only private pay? Is there Medicaid acceptance? Like, what kind of contracts do they have with their MCOs? So kind of figuring out what the big picture. Again, we always tell people in the audience that these are generic answers, right? Like if your situation is very specific, that's something else that you would talk to more in depth, so they could give you a more detailed experience as far as, all right, so now if your situation's this, maybe we could do home health and supportive home care. We can do 24/7. And I think that's the big thing that people take away, is supportive home care can do up to 24/7 care, whereas home health isn't a 24/7 care. So I think that's very helpful for families to just understand the services that are available, and then have those questions about, you know, the money or the referrals, or how to even search for somebody, how to pick for, like, how do you pick an agency? And a lot of the panel members will say, interview or talk to as many people as you want, right? That's something that we tell people in the office all the time, is you can talk to as many or as little service agencies as you want, and you pick whatever. You're going to just trust your gut with whatever decision. They thought that maybe there were certain qualifications for supportive home care that they would have to, you know, meet these, you know, check these boxes to be eligible. So they usually have those questions in that type of format. So that's why we chose the two, because they can then explain the differences between, like I said, the supportive home care and then the home health side. So the next is the planning services side. Again, this is very generic. For this spot on the panel, we have 3 people. So we usually have advanced care coordinators from the hospital, so locally either Marshfield Clinic or Aspirus. We have a financial planner, and we have a real estate agent. And the reason a real estate agent is involved, and she always says on the panel that she's kind of the oddball, but I think she also says very clearly, like, these services cost money, right? And if you have to figure out what your assets are worth, she's a resource for people that maybe they haven't thought about that. Financial planning can talk about the long-term care insurance policies, or how are you going to make your finances last the longest? Again, people don't think of that, but again, it's another resource for people to kind of start thinking about the future planning. Advanced directives, you can also use an attorney, right? You can use anybody that specializes in understanding and being able to give that information. So when we do our Caregiver Roadmap event, which is that caregiver conference in November, we have an attorney usually there for either a breakout session or a keynote. And this year we're actually doing an advanced care planning workshop. So they'll be able to work together. So you're gonna have the advanced care planners as well as the attorney to be able to witness and complete power of attorney. So it really just shows that advanced planning isn't just your power of attorney or advanced directives. It really is trying to figure out your finances and figuring that out. So that's why we chose to have 3 representatives instead of kind of that broad topic of, okay, advanced planning is important. You want to hit these 3 topics and move forward. It's just, I think when you give a face to a service, then people start thinking, okay, oh, that makes sense that someone would be able to help with my long-term care insurance or whatever that looks like for them. So the next is the skilled nursing home. So we have a discharge planner. We've got admissions from here. We've had nursing home administrators participate on this panel. And just basically to show what is the difference between a skilled nursing facility and an assisted living. And usually at this point in the panel, the person who is representing the nursing home and the person who's representing the assisted living kind of break down all the myths of every facility is a nursing home, right? So then they kind of talk about payer sources. Maybe it's level of care needed, but they also talk about the respite or the rehab option, and then saying like what the cost difference is from a nursing home to an assisted living. And then when we kind of transition, these ones are pretty self-explanatory as far as setup, right? So they kind of lay it out of, here's the scenario of, does this person need this high level of care, or do they go to assisted living? So they're able to break that down for them, because a lot of times people will say, well, I had rehab and I wanted them to stay in there. So they'll kind of say, okay, well, you can stay in there, but just know the cost difference of staying in, the skilled nursing facility versus the assisted living facility. So it really is helpful for people to kind of understand. This is usually where a lot of the panel questions come from. The facility questions usually take up a lot of time just because there's something that caregivers don't really know about, right? You might hear neighbors talking about certain situations, but there's a lot of confusion when it comes to the facilities and how everything is different. In the assisted living side, we usually just bring in somebody from an assisted living. So there is senior housing, obviously, and there's still the independent living that can be involved in this, but we wanted, like I said, to make this as short as possible. And like I said, it takes about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. So we've had admissions from here. We've had the facility managers, we've had the administrators, we've had community relations. So basically anybody who can talk to what their facility provides. Again, a lot of the times there's not like, I work at this facility, come to this facility. It really is, this is the facility I represent, but here's what the world of assisted living looks like. And can that be, how do you choose? So sometimes we'll print out the choosing an assisted living document so people who are attending can have that as a resource. Every person we've had on the panel says, look at multiples, right? Because what's good for you might not be good for the person you're sitting next to. And they're able then to talk about the respite stays that are available. So even if you wanted to trial, maybe I want to try this facility, but I'm going on vacation, so you can use the respite stay. So they explain that. They also talk about the memory care side, like if there's certain qualifications for their facility, or how do you pick a facility if you're dealing with somebody with dementia. So it really has been helpful in kind of moving things forward. And then some of the questions that come up when we're talking about this is, how do I pay, right? That's usually something that is constantly in question. They'll say like, what options are available? They'll ask and say, well, can I ask people what their experiences are? Of course, it's encouraged. So that's kind of how that conversation goes when people are having very broad questions because they just don't know, right? Or the question that comes up a lot too is, well, when do I know if it's time? When do I know it's time to start looking? How do wait lists look? So usually it's just trying to give people the most accurate information based off of one facility. And usually the representatives will always say, like, if you have these questions and you have a facility in mind, just give that facility a call and they'll give you the answer based on their facility. But just know that every facility runs things a little bit differently when it comes to, let's say, admission, or maybe it's just tours in general. So they always say, just call the facility of interest, and whether you're scheduling a tour or just having that conversation over the phone, that can be helpful. And then, of course, the end of the roadmap is end of life. And how we use this is we have a hospice care agency that's on board, and then also a funeral home director. And when we talk about this, like, of course, funeral home is at the end of life, but funeral home and funeral planning can be in that planning stage. So we always say, like, while the person's at the end of the roadmap, you're basically going to be using this as the planning stage too. So they can kind of float back and forth. This is where I also said that you could add palliative care depending on your area. So we have a lot of the times our hospice and home health will work together and do palliative care instead of a specific palliative care. And sometimes when they're talking about it, they're saying if there's a palliative care that you're interested in, that is something. But when we try to keep it as broad as possible, we do talk about it. It's just not listed on the roadmap itself. So when you're choosing somebody for hospice, we've had their administrators, we've had their account liaisons. Again, it doesn't have to be a specific person as long as they're from that agency and can speak to, payer sources, eligibility, how you go about after the 6 months, if the person's still living, how do you requalify, things like that. I think that are important for families to kind of move forward. And I think when you're kind of organizing, you're going to find certain things that maybe work or don't work for your community. We offer the panel at all times. So it doesn't, it's not just in the morning or afternoon or evenings. It really is trying to cater toward any kind of caregiver we may come in contact with. And then throughout this, we also share helpful resources. So these resources are basically the ones that come up. How do you choose an assisted living? How do you choose an adult family home? How do you choose an RCAC? So a lot of this does come from the organization of just trying to keep things very broad, because I think when we had created this, if we would have included every single resource possible, how overwhelming would that be if they see, the panel obviously would be a lot more than 10 to 12 people. There's also VA, right? VA could be added in here, and it usually is added or asked about in panels. And because VA benefits are so specific, what we usually will tell people is to talk to your veteran service officer. Why? Because eligibility is all different. And a lot of times people at that point had never even heard that a veteran service officer was something that they could connect to. So it really is the resource sharing that I think gets people in a room full of other caregivers and professionals to have the conversations of what services are available or what steps are next. So that's the brief overview. So now it's questions. What questions do you guys have as far as the roadmap itself, how we do the panel, how we organize it, how we promote it? What kind of questions do you guys have as far as the roadmap in general?
Carley, thank you for that amazing, succinct overview of this wonderful tool. Really appreciate it. At this time, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand or on mic and turn on your camera if you can and ask a question. Kayla, feel free to mic and ask.
Hi, Carly. Thank you all for letting me join this meeting. I'm not a usual attendee, but really wanted to hear this presentation by Carly, and I'm grateful I did. Carly, one question I had is, have you considered or have you recorded this to have available for people who might not be able to attend? And do you find it still important to hold the live versions for like the conversation and questions that occur? Do you think a video, a one-time video can be a good tool as well?
Yeah, we actually had a videographer at our last one who did the whole thing. And I think the big thing with that is he's still editing it. And I think it'll be very helpful for professionals as well as caregivers to kind of see how it's facilitated. I do think sometimes people would prefer in person and having those live questions in case they have new questions. But I think too, when we have that as a resource, people are going to have maybe questions that come up. So I think it really is going to depend on the comfort level of the person. Maybe they can't leave. So it is a resource that will go up on our YouTube channel when it's ready. And then people are going to have access to it. I think it really could just depend on the situation.
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking it could be difficult. You've done a great job of like coordinating and organizing everybody on a quarterly basis, but I imagine that's quite a bit of coordination. So a video could be helpful.
I think it's reaching new people, which is kind of cool. Different caregivers are coming in. And I think the biggest thing is connecting with local resources that they have no idea. So if they're coming into the ADRC, we always host it here just because we have the technology to. So we can always offer it hybrid, but then they're able afterwards to have those maybe intimate conversations or vulnerable conversations that maybe they wouldn't have had before. Or maybe it's families that have worked with, myself or my supervisor, that they're more comfortable. Okay, here are the people, like Carley knows my situation. Can we have conversation as far as what's next? Where do I start? Like, they want that handholding. And I think that helps because they're not having to pay to speak to the attorney that's on the panel. They're not having to pay or coordinate respite to go to an appointment. It's already happening in that room. So I think there's a lot of networking that happens that they don't really necessarily plan to have. But I think once they're in a room with people who understand and are having the same questions at them, I think it kind of lowers the guard a little bit to be a little bit more comfortable with attending. But yeah, the attendance is really, we've never had one where no one shows up. Of
Thanks, Carley.
course, you're welcome.
Carley, would you mind stop sharing your screen now, and then we can go into the Brady Bunch tile look for everybody? There are a couple of questions in the chat, but I did want to just piggyback with the comment about the taping or videotaping of a session. I think in today's age, it's phenomenal to have multiple options. And so even if someone saw it online, it may prompt them to go in person. And then still to embrace the natural connections that do happen when you're in person, and ability to chat or check with the person sitting next to you and learn something from them. So I think it's really good that you have provided multiple ways to do this, and it's not a one and done. If someone wants to come back, they're welcome to come back. So good for you. There is a question about, will there be a PDF of the roadmap, and can it be unlocked so the modifications can be made?
We do have, so that'll be added to the WDRN. If there's modifications, we just have people email us to ask, as long, because we basically have to run them past our corp counsel and just make sure everything's okay as far as modifications. But usually so far, everyone has been modified or been able to modify them appropriately.
And a request to modify something, that's just the actual visual of the roadmap, but not necessarily the other pieces?
Are you meaning like sometimes people want to modify to add additional services? So like for Brown County, when they're doing their Hmong services, obviously they're going to be completely different than what's on our roadmap. So usually it's just, we just ask that people ask us, like, if this is the modifications we're thinking of, is that okay? And then we can send over the modified.
Perfect, sounds good. And then do you think that local agencies such as funeral homes, attorneys and stuff are willing to present? And this comes from Shelley. Do you find that they're willing to present?
Yeah, we haven't had any. Usually the only thing we have is, I was busy. They're usually very willing. And I think too, if you're looking at it from a funeral home or, an attorney side, it's free marketing for them, right? If they're on that panel, they're getting their name out there. So we haven't had any kickback with them, but I think it really is trying to find the champion in your community that is okay with the public speaking side or the promotion side, because some people aren't okay with, they're uncomfortable in that setting, but we haven't had any problems with them wanting to be actively involved.
So one of the questions that came up at the Alzheimer's Association presentation that you had done, and you touched on, is that sometimes you have actually several of one type of service that want to present. How do you handle or navigate where you have, like, say, 6 assisted livings wanting to present?
We always do it. So if we send out an email, it's first come, first serve, because that's the fairest way. But if I come back and there's 3 assisted livings, I will then schedule them for the rest of whatever we have coming up. So they were then guaranteed that spot. So like, for instance, this one in November, for people who maybe even couldn't attend, then I just send out the email to everybody again if there isn't somebody on like the wait list for a presenter. So that's kind of how we've cycled through. And so far I haven't had any problems with that. So that's been helpful. And also sometimes if we have maybe somebody who's interested in being a part of the panel but has never presented before, they'll come and be kind of in the audience to kind of see how it works, because it really is hard to say, okay, this is kind of how the panel looks, right? If you're kind of just talking it through, it can seem kind of awkward as far as the segment and what do I share? How much do I share in that small period of time to be cognizant of everybody else's time? So that's how we've used, just kind of, if somebody's interested, I write their name down, and when the next dates, if I don't already have them, they already getting booked out for those sections.
Sounds good. And I really do appreciate that. Do you ever have problems where one facility just presenter keeps saying, I want to, and they're Johnny in the spot and they email back real fast, or you're lining them up for future one? Does that take care of that issue?
To be completely honest, there really isn't a lot of, I don't want to say a lot of interest, but there really is, like when I send out the email, there is a couple that are always wanting to do it. And if there's nobody else, it's offered to everybody every single time. It just happens that sometimes it can be the same person every single time we offer it, but it is offered to some people. Or every people for it's just not all people are the ones that are saying, yeah, I want to do it. I wish that was the problem because we could probably offer it more frequently at that point.
Sounds good. And then the roadmap, there's interest that will be posted on the WDRN with the on the website with the recording. But Carley, if they email you directly, would you put your email in the chat? And so people can pick it up through the chat now if they'd like, and they can email you, because they're going to have to do that anyway if they want to make adjustments. And then let's see. So Kristen had said it would be good to add logos and other local sources. Kristen, would you like to elaborate on that? Kristen Meyer, a comment. Okay, if you do, Kristen, feel free to jump on. And then, okay, Carley's in there. And then it sounds like I asked a question that someone was already thinking about, so that's good. Other questions, feel free to unmute or again, use the chat. I'm going to do something unwielding right now. If you know how to locate your emojis, they're on the bottom of your screen, has like a little happy face with a little plus for me. How many, I just want kind of to get a visual, how many of you on this call think this is a tool or a concept that you could adapt to what you are doing? If you want to raise your hand, we can kind of get a visual. Oh, thumbs up. I love you too, creative people. So sounds like, it looks like on the visual that there are quite a few. Excellent. Anybody make a comment regarding the downsides of using a tool like this? Are there any drawbacks? Doesn't look that way.
The only thing I can think of, Jody, is for some families who are just so new to this, and I'm sure, Carly, you would agree, even that roadmap could be a little overwhelming.
Yeah, and we always, excuse me, in the facilitation, I always tell people read the room, right? Like if we're, for my first meeting, I never bring this out because of the fact that I want them to identify their main concern. Like, right, we don't want to kind of overwhelm them. But I know my supervisor, when she's doing AFCSP, when they're talking about spending money, she uses it as kind of a talking point where she'll start, okay, this is identify where you're at in the roadmap, and we'll talk about this. But then as they continually meet with her, then she'll go through the map. So nobody really goes through the tool right away, like, hey, here you go. Because I agree, Bonnie, it is way too overwhelming, even when it's just very generic. I think when people look at that, especially when they see the hospice side, maybe they're brand new to a diagnosis, or maybe they're just brand new to caregiving in general, that can be very intimidating.
So we have a few hands up. Sarah, your hand was up, but it looks like it fell off. Sarah, did you have a comment or a question?
No, I don't have any, sorry.
Okay, and then Dave, do you have a question? Dave Schmidt? Or are these hands still up for my little poll? Sorry. Okay, sorry about that. I forgot to tell you to take them down. I just was excited that there might be a few more questions here. Sorry about that. Any other comments or thoughts? It's a pretty nice, simple, lined up tool. And what I think is really helpful is the visual matches some content that you can kind of anchor information and resources for folks. So that is very exciting. I think it's a great tool. I am going to put in the chat here real quick a survey that we do on our webinars. And so you're welcome to take that survey if you'd like to. And then if there aren't any more questions, I just really appreciate Carley, who's from Portage County, not Dodge, for her willingness to come on and share a really awesome tool that is very adaptable to many different ways of using it in your community. So Our next webinar will be on November 30th. It's going to be the Dementia Live program from a few of the DCSs from Waukesha County. Carley, I would like to turn the floor over to you if you have any parting words or thoughts or comments.
And I know in the survey too, there is a section that if there's another question that comes up, or if you need, any kind of assistance in implementing this in your county or whatever, I'm going to be available. So I think Jody's going to send that information to me too. So don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. I think it's nice to kind of have the collaboration to say, this is what I'm thinking. Do you think this would work? And I think it truly can work in any kind of atmosphere. You just make it fit to whatever your community needs. And I think it's something that's obviously when we first started it, was it as organized and fluid? No, it was not, but it really was trial and error to see what works best for not only us and the caregivers, but also the professionals. How does the facilitation work? How does the kind of organization of resources work? But I'm more than happy to help try to see if this is something that'll work for you.
Yes, on this survey, there are at the very end, it's a very, very short survey. It's gonna take you like 2 minutes tops. Just a place where you can put your name or if you have questions and stuff. And so then I can then reconnect with Carley and make sure that you have the chance to interface or connect about that. So, well, with that, I'm gonna turn off the recording.